Yes, hello everybody, and happy to see folks back after a nice lunch break, which was necessary because we got so much food for talk. Maybe without any further ado, let us start the session. We are traveling a little bit. We are looking from the EU outwards in the session. We will think about transformations, external relations, and we have quite a number of cases, case studies, but the first speaker is Sabaheta, and over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Maria. I'll present it now, talk about a book chapter, and the title is EU Green Transition is the Barrier for Socioecological Transformations. Next slide, please. On the next slide, you can see the subtitle of the title of the same chapter. And here it's small, but you can also see the full reference for this work. It will be published in the forthcoming book on socioecological transformations. The study contributes to a body of research that explores the role of supranational state in socioecological transformations, focusing on the EU green policy. Empirically, I explore the how and why, or as you see there, the motives for engaging the language of transformations, framings of transformation and other also related concepts, as well as the perceived barriers for change and what that means for transformational dynamics, the implications for transformations are. In terms of theory, in this chapter, we don't develop the theoretical framework, but we draw from our existing work where transformations are framed as anti-hegemonic, as well as decolonial, post-growth, and post-capitalist efforts and initiatives. Analytical elements that we consider are the following, also that I think are, yes, on the slide. So the structural shifts as well as onto epistemic shifts. So we are talking about undoing structural violence and also unlearning some of the ontological and epistemic roots for that violence, or the hierarchies, universalism, and so on. We also talk about the colonial justice approach. It's one of the analytical elements, and I had a talk in the morning about that one. Methods-wise, so this chapter is based on a 2-day workshop sorry, I don't remember everything. I have to read everything. 2-day workshop with 21 participants and 12 semi-structured interviews with EU policymakers. Both happened in autumn 2022. And the policies and questions, as I mentioned already, are bioeconomy and the EU Green Deal. And next slide. So some contextualization is needed before we proceed with the empirical part. So having framed transformations in a really way, as I said, so as anti-hegemonic and onto epistemic, decolonial, and structural unlearning, undoing, it becomes quite apparent that the EU as an entity historically as currently embedded within the dominant colonial capitalist institutions and ideologies, but also actively participating in the ongoing colonizations, or actively participating, supporting it very well, and silencing it and rationalizing it, is far from motivated to transform in a way as we, and not just we, but as this literature, body of literature frames transformation. As doing so would imply a step towards self-abolition, at least in the form of the EU as we know it now. Nonetheless, considering the dissatisfaction with how the EU and its liberal economic and political allies have handled, or better not handled, the socio-ecological crisis and injustices, including the widening of inequality gaps within the EU as well. So there is a growing demand for change by the growing number of citizens who have been pushed to the fringes by the existing structures and ideologies. So the EU is compelled to engage in the language of transitions and transformations. So this was just a kind of, you may wonder why even you bother to talk about transformations in this context. So this is the hypothesis or framing behind. But then in the empirical part, we look at how this transformation is talked about, framed, motivated, and so on. So next slide. So with regards to the motives or why the EU talks about transformations, first we have, well, there are two motives, and they are quite different and quite extreme, or at least I see them like that. The first one is the climate concern and associated public pressure for climate justice, for really issues that call for a fundamental shift away from the current way of doing things and the current institutions and ideologies, the capitalist growth-oriented model, and so on and so forth. The second one is then again the EU's ambition to reinvent itself as a global leader in green technologies and decarbonization, especially in the context of the geopolitical upheavals and de facto wars. And like the later geopoliticizes the whole transformation and reveals the EU's appetite for global domination, framed often as competitiveness. Now, how these concepts that I study are framed and talked about. In terms of transformations, can we change slide? Thank you. I didn't say that. Sorry. Great. So transformations. Transformations and transitions were used as synonyms, and this is also captured in the interview quote that I hope you can read. Can you read from there? Okay, perfect. So what I wanted to highlight in addition to this quote is that policymakers believe that transformations or green transition should happen within the existing economic and political structures and by the existing authors leading it. There was, however, the recognition that there is a lack of effectiveness, there is power asymmetries, there are a lot of injustices in those structures, but nonetheless, there was a hesitation for discussing or for wider debating, like really for wider structural or systemic change due to the complexity of the task and due to the urgency for actions, which were seen as, okay, we cannot then do this like long and complicated things. We need to do things fast. In terms of degrowth, okay, great. Degrowth as a term was considered a taboo by many, maybe two people that I interviewed who saw it, despite the term, as a bit as a promise, because as this citation there shows, nonetheless, so they saw some promise there, but they mostly, the policymakers were feeling that the term is not adequate. It is unhelpful, controversial, and so on and so forth. But however, because of this recognition of what we discussed in the context in the workshop about degrowth, there was a lot of people pointed out, oh, we are talking about this, about sustainable consumption, sufficiency, enoughness, and this language were entering the policy discourses actually in the bioeconomy, for instance, in the bioeconomy policy context. And finally, the question of justice. There, yes. There was wide recognition of the importance of justice, including global justice, including the recognition of the EU's colonial past and the continued dispossession and yielding of colonization of land. There was also recognition and acknowledgement for the epistemic domination of that the EU is doing through the EU policies being promoted elsewhere. That was really like personally super surprised me, but nonetheless, then addressing these points at the EU level was seen as hard or impossible due to highly contentious nature of injustice, inequalities, and so the default policy toolbox was always we can compensate for this, we know, but we can mitigate the harms and so on. Okay, there are 8 barriers for transformations, most of which, except the 2 that you're seeing that are highlighted, the respondents themselves framed as a barrier for transformation. The 2 that you see, so the geopolitics, war and the rising power and threat of China, and the perceived lack of mandate and incentives to act on issues of justice and degrowth. These are my, I frame them as, they were discussed in the data, but I frame them as de facto barriers or impediments, while they were not framed in that context by the respondents. So the hierarchy, the skewed science policy interface, industry and corporate lobbying, reputational risks. If you do speak about a radical change or something, you will be branded as communist and therefore not very welcomed in the big meetings. Bureaucracy, quantitative and goal-oriented criteria and measures were also recognized as impediments because you cannot capture with these kind of standards and measures, you cannot capture the complexity if you talk about justice or decoloniality or so. Again, with this first, citation, it kind of says that, well, policies are not meant to lead the change. It's more like they're lagging behind for a variety of reasons. And those reasons, I say, was a bit like a rigidity as a way of working, avoiding rather than embracing complexity, or some kind of more discussing in that context. But the question, I guess, the way it is, the transformations, the way it is institutionalized and socialized, it prioritizes greening of what we see a problem to be a problem, rather than really addressing it and trying to be honest with ourselves and our roles and motivations. And thanks.
And over to you, Maria. Please introduce you briefly.
Okay, I'm an environmental sociologist, and I'm based at University Augsburg in southern Germany, Bavaria. And my research interests include political ecology, ecofeminism, critical development theory, decolonial critique, global socioecological inequalities, and my regional focus is mostly on Brazil, but also on Germany. And I will talk about voluntary carbon offsetting in the Amazon basin, a market-based approach to climate protection. And the basic idea is that those who emit carbon dioxide by burning fossil fuels pay those who absorb it by setting up renewable energy projects or protecting forests, and I will focus on the latter. Carbon offsetting is one pillar of the green transformation of the European Union towards climate neutrality. I just want to mention there are 2 separate markets in Europe, the mandatory emissions trading system and the voluntary market for companies or individuals who want to contribute for climate change mitigation beyond regular requirements. And I'm going to talk about the second, and hopefully you can follow. Next slide, please. And the contradictions of this compensation approach becomes apparent in the coalition agreement between Germany's new governing parties. And I just want to mention that today the designated Chancellor, Merz, was not elected by this coalition. So this has never happened before, and you will see. Nevertheless, I think this coalition agreement expresses something that goes beyond Germany and includes also a European vision. They emphasize that Germany must both remain an industrialized country and become climate neutral. Further, the German and European climate targets are to be achieved through CO2 reductions and the offsetting of negative emissions, but also to a limited extent, I'm quoting, through highly qualified and credible CO2 reductions in non-European partner countries. Therefore, the German decision makers anticipate that carbon emissions cannot be reduced and compensated within Europe alone. to sustain this economic growth model, please. One option for carbon offsetting outside Europe could be the framework for a global carbon market, which was established at the last climate conference. Currently, this is not possible. In this talk, I would like to show that voluntary carbon offsetting does not address, but externalizes climate change mitigation to peripheral regions and marginalized groups. And I would like to introduce to you this externalization concept, which is actually the other side of extractivism. And I draw on the concept of externalization, which was coined by ecofeminist thinkers Adelheid Biesecker and Uta von Winterfeld, and was further developed by Anna Save. And they argue that capitalism depends on what they call a non-capitalist outside. In other words, for capitalism to function and to create value, it relies on non-paid human and non-human reproduction work, like unpaid care work, we heard about this morning, or the natural reproduction of, for instance, fertile soil. And this outside, and this is important, must be produced actively as external to be appropriated and exploited as workforces or carbon sinks. And this is possible because groups, regions, or natural processes are constructed as inferior. Externalizing environmental costs requires internalization by social groups or sinks. However, complete internalization, this is one of their main arguments, is not possible in growth capitalism because it generates new externalizations and so on. And I'm going to show you this now. How does carbon offsetting works? Large companies or individuals buy carbon credits from projects that invest in renewable energy or energy projects or protect forests, thereby absorbing the same amount of CO2 and utilizing it. And the basic idea is that it is not important for the climate where greenhouse gases are emitted and where they are at best compensated for. And the diagram illustrates the externalization of climate change mitigation. In most cases, investing in projects in the global south is more profitable. The most important mechanism of carbon offsetting is REDD+, and most of you know this mechanism. The acronym is Reducing Deforestation, Forest Degradation, Emissions in Developing Countries. The plus represents additional forest-related activities that protect the climate, namely sustainable forest management. And under this scheme, so-called developing countries can receive the so-called results-based payments for emission reductions when they reduce deforestation. And the basic idea is to create financial incentives for forest conservation. So the emissions saved must be measured. Carbon accounting, I learned a lot of vocabulary in last year, is crucial here. And the mechanism is still limited to the voluntary carbon market, so companies cannot use it to offset their mandatory emissions reductions. It is based on a triple win narrative, protecting the climate and forest while enabling sustainable development for local populations in the tropics. And the argument is that deforestation would have taken place without the REDD project. In 2022, around 700 REDD projects were implemented in almost 60 countries. Brazil is significant for the implementation of REDD and carbon offsetting, and also for the ongoing debate on this mechanism. First, because the governments want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Second, it was one of the first countries to implement REDD projects in South America because forest conservation is the focus of its climate protection strategy. Deforestation accounts for the largest share of Brazil's national CO2 emissions. Third, in 2024, the government launched the Pact for Ecological Transformation towards a new development model for a low carbon economy. So we can see that ecological modernization project is just as much a goal here as in Europe. Finally, Brazil will host the climate conference, the COP30 in Belém in November this year, fueling the debate on carbon offsetting. It will establish a mandatory carbon market at the national level, which is inspired by the European cap and trade system. And in addition, it is currently setting up jurisdictional REDD programs to regulate the voluntary carbon market, which has come under criticism in recent years. And the main critique, next one. First is a technical one. The RED scheme has various technical problems. For instance, I just mentioned one, calculating carbon removal is controversial. This is because they are based on expert estimations of how much forest would have been cut down without the RED project. This is shown in the graph. The estimate of carbon emissions from deforestation is shown in blue, and the intervention of the RED project for forest protection is shown in red, and the potential carbon credits are derived from the difference. So the scheme is very speculative and invites the project developer to calculate the baseline as high as possible. The higher the baseline, the more carbon credits are generated and can be traded. So therefore, it's not surprising that overcrediting occurs. Journalists uncovered this in 2023, leading to the famous Vera scandal. And this led to prices of the entire voluntary carbon market, prices fell, etc. However, this was not the end of RED and voluntary carbon offsetting. Vera has revised its standard, made it stricter. At the same time, many stakeholders in Brazil and beyond are promoting the jurisdictional mechanism and hoping for new or more revenues. Jurisdictional RED means doing RED not just in a single project, but across a whole state or province or region. And the aim is to avoid, for instance, double counting, etc. And national or subnational governments play a critical role in monitoring. However, the jurisdictional RED approach cannot solve the fundamental problem of externalization as a capitalist principle. This is because natural forests cannot internalize or sequester all of these additional emissions. There's a fundamental criticism of Larry Lohmann and many others of this very idea of compensation, because it equates different materialities, ecological cycles, temporalities. So it obscures the historical, social, spatial context of carbon emission and sequestration. Consequently, this equation distracts from the fact that the only solution is to consume less fossil energy in the industrialized centers. The same can be observed at the socio-ecological level. Most RED projects are not implemented in regions where the agribusiness or mining sector is expanding and forests are being cleared. Instead, they are implemented in indigenous territories that have proven to be the best at protecting forests. So carbon offsetting is a new form of externalizing the climate crisis to marginalized regions and communities. What is new is that not only the damage of resource extraction and extractivism by mining or agribusiness are outsourced, but also the mitigation of climate change, which is not working. The specific context that enables this externalization is what Alimonda refers to as the coloniality of nature. It is precisely because this region and its population are marginalized that they can be, in Jason Wood's term, cheapened for externalization. Many studies reveal negative impacts of internalization. So, for instance, indigenous people lose control of their territories. For instance, they are not allowed to pursue small-scale farming practices such as slash and burn. Instead, they must leave the forest untouched and generate as many carbon credits as possible. Therefore, they give up their emission rights to companies which use them to offset their much more climate-damaging practices. Finally, and this I would really like to point out, because we are going to focus on this in our project, social movements and indigenous communities are divided on the jurisdictional RED approach. Indigenous organizations, social movements are currently protesting a deal between the state of Pará and the Leaf Coalition, but the other part supports it. So next slide, please. Just to jump to a last aspect, finally, the externalization of climate change mitigation by market-based schemes can worsen land conflicts. In the Brazilian context, carbon offsetting has triggered carbon grabbing, a new form of land grabbing. I can explain this to you afterwards because time's flying. Next slide. And this brings me to the conclusion and discussion. The concept of compensation contradicts the idea of a just socio-ecological transformation because it reproduces the status quo and continuously externalizes the climate crisis. carbon offsetting exacerbates, this is one of the main critique, the climate crisis, because it distracts attention from addressing the causes. Instead of spending another 20 years debating the monitoring of carbon offsetting, the actors need to shift the focus to proven forest and climate protection strategies, namely indigenous territorial rights. In the European context, Biesecker and Winterfeld suggest discussing the radical implications of prohibiting externalization, as this reflection could be a first step towards a just socio-ecological transformation. Last slide, last aspects. However, in the context of the global right-wing backlash, the question arises of what significance climate protection will have in the future and the whole ecological modernization project. And I would love to discuss this aspect with you. In my interpretation, it's not the end of the ecological modernization project. There's a lot of infrastructure that cannot simply be dismantled, but we are seeing, this is what other talks talked about today, we're seeing an increase in extractivism and externalization in the green and brown economy. And against this main background is, yeah, how can we as critical researchers strengthen the approaches and social movements that stand for an alternative and just socio-ecological transformation? I think this is one of our common questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maria. Any questions? Pressing questions before you run away? Yeah. No questions. Then I would say we move over to the next speaker. And now we are moving, you heard about the Green Deal, we heard about carbon offsetting, and now I call for Toni Haastrup. And we will learn a little bit about exporting feminist policy. And
Haastrup, I'm a professor in global politics at the University of Manchester. And my research primarily looks at global power hierarchies, racialized and gendered hierarchies. So I look at EU foreign policies in Africa, broadly speaking, with the focus on sort of peace and security and development. But I also do work on so-called feminist foreign policies. And I've been doing this work for around 10 years now. And I want to talk a little bit about feminist foreign policy in the context of the EU's external relations. I should apologize in advance that I don't do anything around multi-species. I know a little bit about green stuff, like I like to call it, but hopefully you'll be able to see some of the connections as they're relevant. Weirdly enough, when this version of the slides I actually wrote 2 years ago, and this was the title. So I don't know how you decided on the particular panel title, but very appropriate. Next slide, please. So I would run quickly through an introduction that sort of contextualizes what the EU is, or the ways in which I'm thinking about the EU in the context of feminist foreign policy, mostly because the European Union does not actually have a feminist foreign policy. So you might wonder, why are we talking about it then? And then I'll talk a bit about feminist foreign policy itself, its evolution, and then this idea that I tried to develop with 2 colleagues. The idea is around feminist power Europe and what that means and what kind of feminist power the EU is or could be. And then that leads me to sort of trying to deconstruct the vision of feminism that the EU exhibits in its foreign policies. And part of why we thought that was really important is because a lot of this EU as a potential feminist power is very much directed in its foreign policies towards African countries, including towards the African Union. And then I will conclude with some thoughts, which I think resonate with some of what some of my other colleagues have said. Next slide, please. Yeah, of course. In terms of the introduction, there's this myth that the European Union is a gender equal polity, and that comes from the years where the EU has sort of developed policies around employment equality, right? But I think one of the things that we often forget in that context is, well, the EU kind of developed equality policy in the employment sphere because they wanted to make employment more efficient, right? So it's still very much within the confines of the ways in which the EU thinks of itself as a liberal power. But over the years, we have seen the EU increasingly adopt the language of feminism. So there's almost no EU document that you open that has gender equality in it that doesn't have the concept intersectionality. Now, anyone can talk about gender equality, but intersectionality is a very specific Black feminist concept. So we increasingly see it in the ways in which the EU describes itself. We see it in the way the EU talks about the things it wants to do in other places, particularly in the context of its development policies, but also peace and security policies. But it's not just the EU in terms of just Brussels. So we're talking about Commission specifically, but we're also talking about the European Parliament, and as we know, the member states, which I'll come to in a moment. What this means, what this has meant is that over sort of the last, I would say, 7 years or so, because it seems as if the EU is increasingly comfortable with taking on this sort of feminist concepts, there have been increasing demands, particularly from civil society in Europe, calling for the European Union to adopt a feminist foreign policy. And this is where I start to diverge, because although I am interested in feminist foreign policy, I'm wondering, why would we ask the EU to consider a feminist foreign policy? What does it take to be a feminist actor in general, but also in the area of foreign policy? And why would we demand this of the EU's external relations? Also, what might we be giving up when we make these demands? Next, please. So, feminist foreign policy. Now, feminist foreign policy is a relatively new idea. It comes from 2014, when the Swedish foreign minister coined the concept and says that Sweden will now have a feminist foreign policy. And as someone who's been doing research on external relations, but also gender for many years, I felt, as did a lot of my colleagues, that there's a bit of promise in this idea of a feminist foreign policy, because at least we're able to use feminism at the high level. And a lot of people also saw it as sort of a progress from where gender equality had sat in international relations, which had, up until then, had been in the area of women, peace, and security. So in the evolution of feminist foreign policy from Sweden to a lot of other countries across Europe, we can argue that feminist foreign policy, in principle, is a foreign policy shift, where states, in particular, are now being asked to think differently about what they do in their external relations in ways that are feminist. But at the same time, there isn't a consistency around what feminism is being invoked when the states are ostensibly making the shift. A lot of times when European states say they want to adopt feminist foreign policy, they lean into the EU's feminist credentials as well. So EU member states aren't just sort of saying we're going to be feminists by ourselves, but they leverage a lot of the things that the EU does in its external relations, usually focusing on gender equality policies. And again, this has helped to reinforce this idea that the EU itself can do feminist foreign policy, either as an amalgamation of what member states do, or in its own specific external relations. Next slide. So, in the context of the work that we've been doing and how we sort of try to understand this intensity around the EU wanting to be a feminist foreign policy actor, we went back to look at what the EU actually is. And there is no consensus on what the EU is, but where you can begin to sort of look at the different ways in which the EU articulates itself is in this idea of the EU as a power. So the most famous iteration of that is probably the EU as normative power, where Ian Manners argues that the EU, it's not just about the identity of the EU, which might be seen as static, but it's also about what the EU does. And that builds on prior conceptualizations of the EU as economic power, but also the EU as a civilian power, as well as the EU as an ethical power. And in looking at both EU documents and its practices, looking at what we call the gender equality acquis in the external relations context, we could argue that the EU is some sort of feminist power. And we do that by sort of tracing the ways in which gender equality, understandings of gender equality and gender has actually evolved from within the EU to its external relations. And it's in external relations that we start to see the EU actually take on ideas like intersectionality. So the core framing documents or the core framing policies for the EU external relations that I think reinforce this are its Gender Action Plans 1 to 3, which was over about 20 years, as well as commitments that the EU has made to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which is the global normative and policy agenda dealing with the inclusion of gender perspectives in peace and security. And across all of this, the EU tries to make the ideas of gender and feminism its own, so sort of a special EU understanding of what feminism could be. And of course, when this discourse around feminist foreign policy started, the EU also used the opportunity to really push on us ideas around intersectionality. But of course, one of the questions I had as an academic was, to what extent do these innovations, this inclusion of intersectionality, this inclusion of, language of global south versus global north, global majority, to what extent does that actually constitute a transformative feminist identity for the European Union? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the EU, we've sort of thought of the EU in a range of different ways when it comes to powers. But because feminist foreign policy is assuming a feminist identity for the EU, we asked that question that I mentioned earlier. Is there a possibility of the EU as a feminist power? But importantly, what kind of feminist power? We felt that it was not enough to simply look at the things that the EU does with respect to gender equality, but we need to look at its foreign policy more broadly. And it's there that we can determine whether the EU can actually be a transformative feminist actor. Next slide, please. And so very quickly, the next one. We look at what the feminist vision for the EU is. I think one of the things that is fair to say is that this particular, the feminist vision, and that vision that is pushing for feminist foreign policy is really coming from civil society in the European Union and coming from those we've described as femocrats, so feminists within EU bureaucracies, particularly in parliament. And they understand intersectionality, at least to a certain extent. They understand that, feminism isn't just about the women. So they understand things like structures of power. But when we look at what actually happens in the policy sphere, we notice something different. Next slide, please. So here we note that there are actually 3 varieties of feminisms that are articulated within the EU's external relations: liberal understanding, what I would call light understanding of intersectional, but as well a post-colonial one, at least narratively. I wouldn't go into too much detail about those examples, but I think as the slide shows, it makes a distinction. But the one thing I want to say about intersectionality is people understand intersectionality in a range of different ways. I understand it as the intersection of various structures of power. And if you look at the diagram on that slide, we can see those structures of power. But in the way that the EU understands it, it simply understands it in terms of identities. And some folks might think, well, that's not a big deal, at least we're talking about intersectionality. But I would suggest that it actually has implications because it allows the EU to revert back to what it's comfortable with. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the EU's foreign policy vision, where it's including feminism, women are objects of policy rather than agents. it allows the EU to promote its existing position, but also feminism is deployed as being European, so that even the Black feminist antecedents of something like intersectionality is completely erased from the ways in which the EU thinks about transformations and what feminism could do in its external relations. So I will conclude with sort of 3 key points. One, that the demands for FFP, or feminist foreign policy, I think draws on both old and new assumptions of feminist power Europe, and we see that clearly. But at the same time, it's still important to ask what feminism matters for transformation of the EU as an external relations actor. And where we see the EU definitely has included feminism, it has not necessarily led to transformation. And finally, that themes in the EU discourse, where we actually look at EU foreign policy practice, do allow us to actually trouble the idea of feminist foreign policy, where the argument that I've made in other work is that in as much as foreign policy is something that the state does, there can never really be a feminist foreign policy, and therefore transformation will remain elusive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toni. And yes, transformation seems to be elusive. That's the shared theme so far. Our last speaker is Connie McDermott, and maybe we learn more about transformation or elusive transformation.
Or different visions of transformation. So yes, I'm Connie McDermott. I'm a social scientist based at the University of Oxford within the School of Geography and the Environment. I lead a program called Land, Society and Governance Program. And I spent many years looking at particularly forest governance, but increasingly land and forest governance in different parts of the world. So what I'm going to talk about today is, well, kind of, yeah, definitely trouble the concept of transformation and ask, transformation for what and for whom. And I want to draw on a paper that I did with 23 other authors. So even among the 23 other, not entirely unlike-minded authors, but purposefully diverse with different perspectives, different disciplinary backgrounds, we had to work together to try to agree on how would we think about transformation, or for what and for whom, in the context of the European Union. And so the way that we found very useful for doing this was to apply an equity lens to the EU's global forest governance, or their external governance approaches. Next slide, thanks. In particular, one thing that was actually made this relatively easy is that there tend to be these very dominant trends within foreign policy often. Particular approaches become more and more common and sort of dominant in terms of how, for example, the EU is approaching the issue of deforestation and foreign forest policy. And notable in this is a real shift towards unilateral approaches. And we can talk more if there's time about why that is, but we're starting to see this increasing number of unilateral approaches defined as approaches where unilateral value chain policies that impose requirements on imports that address how those products are produced in other countries. So it only requires a kind of consensus within the EU to agree on what should be done in these other countries. So we see the EU timber regulation, which was in 2010, EU corporate sustainability due diligence directive, another example, EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, and then what we'll talk about now, particularly as an illustrative case, the EU deforestation regulation, which is now due to go into effect in December 2025. Next slide. Okay, so the illustrative case of the EU deforestation regulation, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it's actually, okay. So I will provide a general quick whirlwind introduction to this. Actually, well, definitely groundbreaking in certain sorts of ways policy. And again, we can talk more about that if there's time. But essentially, the policy is aiming to prohibit the import of 7 top forest risk commodities, meaning commodities that are known to be leading drivers of deforestation worldwide, to prohibit the import of those products into the EU unless it can be demonstrated that the production of those products did not drive deforestation. And what's really notable here is not just legal deforestation, but not just illegal deforestation, but also legal deforestation, which means it may be deforestation that was legal in the country of origin, but it still is not going to be allowed into the EU. And it must also, there must be due diligence that these products have complied with environmental and human rights laws. And the products covered are 7 very familiar big global commodities: soya, wood, cattle, oil palm, cocoa, coffee, and rubber. And then the last few products which I highlighted are particularly notable because they're commodities that are often produced by smallholders and mostly in the global south. So moving on. So is this transformative? And the question, am I going to be showing something transformative finally? Well, it depends on who you ask, because I think some people do see it as fairly transformative. What is notable, and what is a quote that it shows up on the European Commission website, is that it's very popular, this policy in the EU. So they launched an open public consultation, and the EU got more than the second most popular policy that they've opened up for consultation, and they got the second most number of responses to this legislation. Of course, the way it's worded here is not necessarily the overwhelming support for what is actually the EUDR. It's overwhelming support to tackle deforestation and forest degradation. But anyway, it's something there's been a lot of excitement about and a lot of interest in the EU about. Next slide. However, if you go outside the EU, the reception was not always as enthusiastic, to say the least. This is a letter, for example, from Indonesia, Brazil, Malaysia, Paraguay, Thailand, all countries that produce these products. And very different perspective on the EUDR. Complaints have been made to the World Trade Organization that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. It ignores the different local conditions. It will inevitably impose immense costs on exporting and importing countries. It will bear no positive impact on deforestation rates, and may even produce other adverse effects, such as increased poverty, diversion of resources, and hindrance of the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. So very, very different response from outside. So at least it was not the kind of transformation that some other countries are looking for. So how do we navigate this? Because it's not really my position to say necessarily what is transformative or not, what is equitable. Well, what I thought in getting these authors together, we could talk about was, okay, we may not all have the same perspective, but can we agree how we would assess that and what we mean by, transforming for what and for whom? And the concept of equity, we've had, really centuries of discussion within society about what we mean by equity. So there's a lot to draw on in terms of how would we unpack the different conceptions of equity and how they might apply to something like the EUDR. So there's a lot now, a lot of recognition that equity is very multidimensional. It can operate at many scales, especially in a big, international policy like this. And it's also socially constructed. So, but I like to draw, for example, on the Melanie McDermott et al. Paper that highlights this idea of framing equity. The framing equity, which is not heard about as much, but I think is quite important. Because this is where we get to, if you look at a policy like EUDR, who even defines whether equity is relevant to it or not? Who's actually framing, who's setting the agenda? And then who counts as subjects of equity? Who are we concerned about? Smallholders, developing country governments, etc. But then in addition to that, of course, we have now it's been brought up before in the context of justice, similar ideas about distributional questions of equity, how are costs and benefits distributed, procedural questions, who makes decisions and how, and then recognition of whose voice and knowledge are recognized. Next slide. Okay, so how do you apply this sort of complex multi-scalar idea of equity to another very complex and multidimensional, well, I'm calling it here the policy cycle. Thank you. Because I think in the conversations around the EUDR, you often don't hear them reaching around this entire policy cycle. But if you want to talk about equity, it's all arguably relevant. There's the agenda setting. Who set the agenda for this policy in the first place? There's the policymaking process. There's the decision-making, implementation, and monitoring. Next slide. So we brought these two concepts together of a policy cycle and of multidimensional equity to think about how we might start to parse out the different equity dimensions of something like the EUDR. So, under meta equity, you're sort of framing equity under this process of who's writing the rules for the EUDR, policy content, what do those rules contain, how is equity defined, who are the subjects of equity. And then, of course, there's implementation and monitoring. And across all of this, we have to think of these different ways of thinking about equity. So yes, it's complex, but if we start to see disagreement about the equity of a policy like this, at least we can see why partly that might be and how people might draw from different dimensions of equity to make equity claims. Next slide, please. So basically for this paper, just some background on how we went about this, it included a source of review of literature and policy documents to try to understand and assess the development of the EUDR, agenda setting, design, and regulatory text. And then we very specifically decided to hone in on a particular commodity. We looked at cocoa in Ghana, drawing on some of the work that Eric's doing and a number of us. So, and the point of this was not to say that whatever we're saying about cocoa in Ghana is relevant for all the other commodities, because it isn't, or all the other countries. This is one policy that applies to an incredibly diverse set of contexts. And that's part of the point of doing this case study, is to highlight that each commodity is going to be different. And also, very importantly, that if we really care or want to know what its impacts are, we have to do on-the-ground field-based analysis in many different countries to see that. It's not visible from just an EU level. So next slide, please. So just whirlwind through equity issues that clearly pop up. Well, I'm just going to first mention the elephant in the room. We're talking about justice, neocoloniality, et cetera. Well, it's no coincidence that here you have Europe here that deforested many, centuries ago, setting a policy that really is kind of targeted towards where most of the deforestation is happening, which happens to be in the global south. And there happens to be a long colonial history around this. So you basically see, northern former colonial powers imposing import requirements targeting deforestation in the global south. And this comes along with a whole baggage of, all the problems these countries are already facing, stuck at the disadvantaged position in the global trading system. Commodities are key to servicing national debts. There's millions of smallholders dependent on the commodities, et cetera. So from a meta equity perspective, there's some very interesting equity issues there. Next slide. Okay, meta equity whirlwind to illustrate complexity, but also show the importance of thinking about equity and EUDR in the context of Ghana. So Ghana is an interesting case because it's the world's second largest producer of cocoa. And some 700,000 smallholder farmers directly dependent, many other farmers also dependent. And just to put this in perspective, farmers only now receive about 3 to 7% of the value of a chocolate bar, as it is pre-EUDR, compared with 50% in 1970s. And the cocoa sector is heavily indebted. Already a lot of the forward contracts are costing, I guess, 1.8 billion just to service them. So this money isn't going to farmers. There's all kinds of problems with climate change, disease, et cetera. Now on to this. Good news is you don't need to understand all these acronyms because the farmers don't. But the point of this slide is to say that actually there are so many initiatives targeting cocoa farmers to do better, to do sustainable cocoa, to stop emitting carbon, et cetera, on top of this new policy that's just landed. Okay, next slide. And then talking about what is visible or what isn't. Next press there. Thanks. So from an EU perspective, you see these kinds of diagrams that show our whole complex system of creating nice chocolate bars, and then just the farmer. The farmer just submits their cocoa into this. But the research that we do in the field shows, Mark Hirons, or Kume, et cetera, is how actually the complexity and the relational values and social systems that go into just getting the cocoa from the farm to the buying station is just at least as complex, but it's completely invisible to the EU. So depending on your farmer, whether you're sharecropper or your labor, et cetera, you may access your cocoa in different ways. It's very hard to trace where the cocoa is coming from because it's all being mixed up in this very socially complex way. So the EU is hoping for this easily traceable cocoa bean, but I think how cocoa is actually playing out on the ground is pretty much invisible at that sort of higher scale. So next. slide, please. So, oh, sorry, no, that one, very important point. So even though the EUDR has not been implemented yet, we know that some buyers have stopped buying from some farmers because they're too high risk. Not necessarily because they're not producing or they're deforesting, they're just too high risk, so they're out of the market. Next slide, thanks. So in conclusion, it's fair to say, even though nothing yet has happened in terms of a formal implementation, the EUDR does have a kind of de facto equity deficit, certainly from a meta equity perspective, heightened by a legacy of unequal trade relations, long history of international trade-based policies, worsening inequalities, and then just as a way forward, a bit like what I think Saba suggested or someone else earlier today. What if we thought about, we're coming up with a new policy idea that had to go through some kind of equity evaluation to just sort of highlight these issues first and upfront. So thank you. That's it.